All right, real quick, I'm going to go over today. If you notice in a lot of our videos when we are doing a lot of our lifting, our guys are using and girls are using wide stances. When we deadlift, it's called a sumo stance. We also use this stance, and I went over this with the squatting. We use the stance, we use that wide stance off the box. Okay, the reason why we do the wide stance stuff is because we're building our hips up. So when we deadlift, being in that wide stance does a few different things for us. So it forces you to push out and create lateral ground force in order to break the bar off the ground, okay? This makes us use our hips more. When we're in a wide stance, we also use a little less lower back, so we're a little less into the lower back, a little more into our hips. That's a good thing, I feel like, for our athletes. It also forces mobility. So squatting wide and deadlifting wide is forcing the athlete to create that lateral ground force, but also forces mobility. So a lot of kids are really tight in their groin and in their hips, and so if you go narrow with them, they can go knees forward and they can squat right down, they're fine. If we go wide with them, right, some of them in the beginning will have a hard time getting down to this position. So what we do is, if you notice this bar is set up on risers, we could do rack pulls or deadlifts from the risers. We could make it as high as we need it to be so they can get in a good position. Okay, once they're good there, we lower it down an inch. Once they're good there, we lower it down an inch until we're getting to the ground. Now, once we get to the ground, once we get the deadlift off the ground, then we can start going to a deficit where we're actually standing on risers and making it even harder to get down to the bar, okay? This is really forcing the mobility of the hips, the groin area, or the adductors, the inner thigh, and it forces us to be wide. Now, a lot of people, there's a big argument sometimes with being wide. They say, you don't jump from a wide stance and you don't play sports from a wide stance. But in reality, lateral ground force is huge in just about every sport. So if you think about an athlete going to make a cut playing football or basketball, they're going to go and cut. When they cut, what happens? Their feet are way apart. They're creating force laterally into the ground. Okay? If you watch a good sprinter come out of the blocks or a guy come out of the 40-yard dash, if you look from behind, they're actually putting force out into the ground laterally. Okay? So the best guys are out. So they take a step out and they're wide. They're pushing wide. And as they start to go, then they come more in narrow underneath the hips and they stand up and they run. But accelerating out of the blocks or out of a 40-yard dash stance or a 60-yard dash, they're putting force outward into the ground laterally. Being lateral, because of this mobility, and it's harder to be out wide with your feet like that, it shortens the range of motion a little bit, but it takes a little bit out of the quads, especially squatting. It takes it out of the quads, puts it more into the posterior chain, which is what we're looking for. But being wide like that will actually build the narrow too. So if I'm used to squatting wide, and have great mobility out wide, and then I go in, I put the bar in closer, and I'm squatting a more narrow stance, it's actually going to be maybe not easier, but like your strength will carry over from wide to narrow. Being narrow will not carry over to being wide. So that's why we are in a wide stance or a sumo stance a lot of times. Again, lateral ground force is huge. Hip mobility is another thing. So we talked about cutting and we talked about sprinting, but it's also huge in baseball, softball. So when you throw, it's lateral ground force. When you pitch, when you bat, when you swing a bat, all those different things, you wind up in some type of wide stance and pushing laterally into the ground to create that lateral ground force. So again, it's going to be sprinting, any type of cutting, any type of lateral movement like basketball, defensive shuffling, that type of stuff. They all require lateral ground force, and that's just about every sport that I could think of. So the vast majority of our athletes, we go into a wide stance.